Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Talking with Teal. I'm Ryan Nakade, and today I'm here with Luke. So, Luke, thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you all about integral Christianity and the work that you're doing here. First, I'm really curious about your background and upbringing, because I know that when we had talked before, you had mentioned how I think you said you grew up in like a kind of a more conservative Midwestern Christian environment.
hmm
And I'm just curious, what was that like, and how did you go from that to what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. No, I grew up in a very conservative, even fundamentalist Christian upbringing, and so sometimes I like to joke I got a running start on my conveyor belt. But yeah, I mean, I went to Christian school and the whole gamut, and it's just it's a very blue. I mean, even magical, you know, uh, purple environment that there's a lot of indoctrination. There's a lot of a lot of messy stuff there. But uh, in retrospect, it also has a lot of good things. There's a lot of really great values that if you can get to that place of transcend and include, like okay, like it also gave me a devotion. It also gave me a seriousness, a purpose of life, and trying to, and also just those personal experiences, right? I can see people in that place. I know them. I grew up with them, and it helps me have a lot of love and compassion for them. That I didn't always have in my journey, in my process forward. So growing up in that, I was very much in that until I went to college and started to sort of have some growth, growth stage experience. And I said modern, or I said, traditional kind of amber with some magic mythical elements, but also very much in sort of, our US culture is so modern. It's so, our rational education system. And I was, did debate. I was very rational in my mind space a lot. And so, getting into college, I really pressed into that more and got into reading and just reading, discovering people through footnotes. Within that, kind of more conservative experience, I did also find myself always drawn to wanting to have an experience of the divine, to wanting to know God in a personal way. And that's another thing that I think I carry with me that's helpful. But through that, I just felt drawn to the mystical. I felt drawn to the contemplative dimensions within Christianity. And I wasn't shielded enough, I guess, by the tribalists to say, oh, you shouldn't read that, So I went off reading and discovering people through footnotes, and led me into some Quaker expressions, and then kind of into what I'll call my journey of form, and these different forms of church and spiritual gathering. And that led me into a very green postmodern stage, where I did intentional community for a while, in the inner city, and then through that into a whole nother experience. So like I said, I got on the conveyor belt mostly through good fortune and reading, and a few good people along the way that gave me some advice, like don't become a pastor before you're 30. And and I took that, which was good, because otherwise I might have been further indoctrinated. So yeah, just a long journey to kind of run that through that process of evolution and growth. Pretty much within kind of the Christian language and the Christian worldview throughout the whole time. I never really left that personally, and I think that's because of some of the personal experiences I had. Uh, so that's the shortish version.
Yeah. I mean, I love how you kind of immediately went to the good things, the baby that you're trying to keep, and you can throw out the rest of some of the more unhealthy or dogmatic aspects of that. One question that I love to ask people who come from more conservative backgrounds who are interested in integral is, what was it like going into the green phase of your life? I mean, I imagine the kind of blue conservative Christian environment to be like the complete opposite of that. So like, how did you kind of get into that, and what was that transition like for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I had a roommate that I had in college or just after college, and we were doing some campus ministry work together, and he was in a very green space. And I remember when I first started living with him thinking, this guy's kind of hippie-ish, like a little suspicious. Like, I don't know about some of this stuff, but he was a really interesting guy, and he just was really wonderful. And I learned a lot from him. And I had always been really intrigued by form and structure, and I still am, in the sort of lower right quadrant, right? In the ways I early on, I was like, this way that we're doing church is terrible. Like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we gathering in this, with this guy up here? And it's very like 1700s, and I don't know. So, one of the things that he brought around was just this exposure to this new monastic intentional community movement that was happening, and is kind of still happening a little bit, but especially in kind of the mid 2000s, late 2000s. And so discovering that form and reading about that and pressing into that, I always kind of had some monastic impulses myself, but really liked that. So I kind of entered into that postmodern green stage, mostly through the form first. And then we kind of followed that model and started this new monastic intentional community in a very underserved, poor area of Kansas City that had a lot of violence. And so it was kind of this headlong dive into some of those green values and trying to save the world. And it had a solid 5 years in that experience, which really plunged into it and embraced it fully in a lot of ways, and then started to see some of the shadows of it really quickly. So that's what kind of brought me into that space.
Fascinating. Interesting. And then from there, how did you get into integral and find the works of Wilber and other integral thinkers?
Yeah. So anyone who's lived in intentional community knows that it's really messy and really difficult. And so
Oh yeah.
we had quite the experience, but toward the end of that, I had so much invested. I had this great spiritual ego that was, doing it all the right way. And it all just kind of came crashing down. My wife and I had to move to another city, and it wasn't as messy as that, but it just, it really was this ego death experience that I had. And kind of, some people talk about the jump from first tier to second tier. A lot of times that takes an ego death or something like that. So I moved to St. Louis for 5 years with my wife, and that most of that time was sort of this ego death place. And I can talk more about that if you want. But in that space, I continued to learn and study like I did, and that's where I kind of discovered Wilber through Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan friar and teacher, and he talks a lot about integral theory, and that's how I first heard about Wilber and read about him, and that just kind of made sense of so many of my experiences, and the pathway that I'd seen. I could just see those stages so clearly in my life and in the churches around me, and so I approached it at first kind of I approached it first conceptually through learning, but then in this personal space of a real emptiness and waiting for kind of the next stage, I guess, to emerge within me. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you found the integral and it kind of put your life into perspective, and it kind of put everything together for you. And how did the Christian part that was, very much a part of your life start to mix into that? Was it something kind of from the beginning from Richard Rohr, or was that something that it took some more time to kind of piece the integral model together with the Christian thing?
Yeah, so I, like I said, a lot of people go through that kind of stage development, enter into pretty, strong periods of deconstruction. And I had that as well, but my deconstruction was centered more around kind of, again, form and structure and gathering and the, kind of the church or Christendom, and just kind of a lot of the issues with that. I think I was able to sort of hold on to this divine core within me that was in Christian language because of some of the experiences that I'd had, because of some of the deep mystical experiences that I'd had with God, with the divine, that I couldn't shed, that I couldn't just chalk up to, whatever deconstructive process you want to put that through. And so that kind of Christian language. And then again, too, because I had seen, because Integral was introduced to me kind of through Richard Rohr, through this, kind of very progressive Catholic lens. And I just kind of read from all over, across a lot of different Christian sources. And so I didn't really, I knew the breadth of Christianity was much wider than my own personal experience and the problems that I faced and the things that I see in the Western church or whatever. So I never really lost that kind of Christ identity, because of those experiences.
Right, right. And how did this eventually lead up to you doing what you're doing now with the integral Christian groups and working with Paul Smith?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm working with Paul Smith, who's the author of Integral Christianity and another book about the three faces of God. And he's lovely. He's just so wonderful. And I found him. So I did. Richard Rohr has this program called the Living School, which is sort of it's sort of like a wisdom school, and we study Wilbur and a lot of other mystics in that. And I did that, and I discovered Paul, his books, kind of through that process, through reading Wilbur. And Wilbur, mentions Paul in his books quite a bit when he gets onto Christianity. And so I looked him up, and Paul was a pastor of a church here in Kansas City for 49 years. And I was like, I grew up in Kansas City. How did I not know about this guy? But it's probably good that I didn't know about him, because I probably would have condemned him as a heretic. In that stage, right? So when I was ready, so when I moved back to Kansas City, and that's a whole longer story, but I moved back to Kansas City, and I got to look him up. I got to find him and talk with him, because this integral thing is really making sense. And he's taken that and put it into, show how that applies to Christianity. And when I read his books, it was just kind of like, yep, that's exactly right. Yep, that's how I think about it. So it was just that real close kinship. And so I looked him up, and we met, and really just hit it off right away. I mean, we have kind of this soul connection. It's really, really beautiful. And so out of that friendship and that connection and whatnot has sort of grown this expression of, okay, what can we do? What's really needed in the Christian landscape? What's really missing? How can Integral inform growth and evolution for Christianity?
Yeah, so I mean, those are some great questions. So let's get into them. I mean, yeah, kind of give us the whole picture of what some of this work that you and Paul Smith are doing. What is your goal with some of this work? Yeah, just dive in, man.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's practicing loving evolution together. It's the Christianity of tomorrow. How do we evolve Christianity? How do we see evolution of consciousness, evolution of structures, evolution of groups? So kind of taking that to the quadrants, right? And just see within the Christian landscape and my own experience in the Living School and some of the more contemplative groups out there, there's a lot of work that's being done in that upper left quadrant, and sort of that individual growth experience, bringing in contemplative prayer, centering prayer, doing practices to help deepen our consciousness. And that's a great pathway and a great entry point for so many people. But one of the things that Wilbur talks about in the Religion of Tomorrow about the quadrants is when you get up to certain stages, if all of the quadrants aren't in resonance, there's a dissonance, right? If you have a highly developed individual consciousness, but you're in a church experience that's still mostly traditional, that there's a cringe there, or the structures don't support that. So he actually, when all of those can work in harmony, there's this resonant hum that comes, and that really struck a chord with me, because I felt that maybe, I don't know, a handful of times in my life. And it goes back to that, my passion for systems and structures, and then moving down to that lower right quadrant, just the way that we're doing things, the way that we're gathering, the way that churches are still, that a lot of the Christian community is is coming together locally is just really insufficient. It's still structures probably at the traditional level, at the the amber level, and then that lower left quadrant, the we space, that the kind of shared consciousness, again often reflective of certain stages of consciousness. So how do we kind of take all of those spaces into further evolution? So I can answer that a little more practically. So in the upper left quadrant, one thing that Paul and I saw was sort of a lacking of subtle realm mystical experience. So there's kind of a lot of emphasis on the contemplative, a lot of emphasis on, moving into this causal empty space. And that's really important, really wonderful, and really beautiful. But really a lacking of sort of this high subtle mystical experience within Christianity that is very much at the heart of Christianity, and some of the early experiences. And so, the few places that you see that in Christianity today are a lot of times in kind of charismatic circles, and that tends to be tied with a very low stage of development. So again, it's kind of that transcend and include. What are higher expressions of mystical experience? What are these higher states of consciousness that we can enter into that are in the realm of form, that are in the language of Christian guides and Jesus? And second person, that's another big thing with Christianity, is that offers is the second person experience of the divine through the person of Christ. And so that's one of the ways that we're trying to enter into that, to give people experiences of that, somewhat, individually, potentially, but primarily collectively. So kind of our main work at the moment is we space groups. And that's when we enter into the lower left quadrant. And again, that ties into, our old forms of gathering and the ways that people come together, reflecting lower stages of engaging with information, or listening to an expert talk, or kind of this passive receptive mentality in a lot of spiritual spaces for Christian gatherings. And so trying to cultivate a collective practice of co-meditation and entering into both subtle and causal spaces with a group, sharing that heart energy of love, is what we've been doing in our We Space groups. And that's been really exciting, really wonderful for people to experience. And then again, finishing on the lower right quadrant, evolving those systems and forms of gathering is work still yet to be done. I mean, one of the ways that we're doing that is gathering people together online, right? Using video conferencing, software platforms that we can actually connect with people who share some of our passions, or maybe share some of our stages or states of consciousness, so that, it's not so lonely. A lot of evolving Christians feel pretty lonely because, wherever they're at, how many people in their town or city are feeling similar things? Maybe a handful if you're lucky, but, through the internet, we can create those structures ourselves, and then eventually hope to help facilitate through collaboration and innovation, people experimenting with new ways of gathering, with new forms of church, or I don't know if we even want to use that word anymore, but just new ways that we can bring people together to help actually cultivate more of these higher evolved collective experiences and individual experiences.
Great. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to get into there, and I kind of wanted to go back to the left-hand quadrants for a moment and ask you, what are some of the main practices that you guys do in order to have these openings to more subtle, causal, mystical realms of awareness? I mean, is it like some kind of a meditation? And yeah, what is the practice to get that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and this is something we're still experimenting with, and it's evolving. And both Paul and I have some background in some more charismatic expressions, and that has its baggage for sure. So there, again, it's trying to take some of the best elements of that, but not really. I mean, we're not gearing ourselves up in any kind of emotional, music stirring. It's a meditative practice. So, what we're doing in our group so far is what we're doing. And again, this is kind of evolving. And where we started with is we just start with a simple meditation practice. And At first, we kind of let everyone do kind of whatever they do. But we're also discovering that to establish more coherence, we need to kind of synthesize that practice. And what that's looking like is more a development of heart practice, of integrating our heart center and our gut center into our meditative practice. A lot of our contemplative meditative traditions tend to frame things through the mind, through a mind practice, through visuals, through thinking no thoughts, or whatever method it might be. But when we integrate into the heart and do a heart practice of meditation, first of all, that's the more relational space anyway. So when we're entering into we space, our hearts need to be activated, our hearts need to be connected. And there's some different techniques that get you into that space for activating your heart. Heart Math Institute is one in California that talks about that on a more sort of bioenergetic level, which is, we might see as low subtle, but it's one way to start. And then our gut space is our bodily kind of ground of being. So that's also very important in our meditation. We emphasize going to a gut grounding, which you can ground to the earth and the energy fields of the earth. You can also ground into the divine identity within your own center. And doing that connects you to your true self. It connects you to a place of identity, to where when you move back into that heart space, you're able to reach out and connect with other people, not from those kind of ego needs of grasping or affirmation or control or whatever other spaces we might come from when we're not in our healthiest place. But if we're coming from our true self, we're able to move out to one another in love. So that's a glimpse into the method of integrating, our mind space, our heart space, our gut space, because it's really in that heart space that we can move into that shared energetic field. We can move into to that space with one another. And so then the actual mystical presence, the practice of that is, so we'll sit for 15 minutes in that space. And at first it was kind of stay within yourself. And after 15 minutes, we'll hear a bell and then we'll move out into the collective. And that was valuable in the sense that people are really able to notice a shift, right? When you're practicing within yourself and then there's, one moment where everyone moves out, you can really feel that. You can feel that shift. You can feel an energy field of the group, even online, even when we're, thousands of miles apart. The quantum physicists say we're not bound by time and space in some ways. So, so at least in that energetic sense, we're able to actually really palpably experience that. As that's evolved, we've seen more of a process of letting people do that more naturally, kind of move out to the group and then ground back into themselves as they need. And then we transition into a time of what we call transmission or listening to God. And that's when you've hopefully kind of are in this different state of consciousness and you practice listening. And Paul has written about this, and I've written a little bit about this as well, but it's this act of kind of co-creating, of recognizing the divine self within us and the images that emerge, or the pictures, or a lot of people have experiences with spiritual guides. Those might be in Christian forms or not. It might be Jesus. It might be an animal. It might be a saint or someone like that. And I realize that can sound a little woo-woo to some people, and we can talk more about that if you want. But it's these forms of expression of understanding the subtle realm and how that comes to us through metaphors and through, when we talk about collective wisdom, it can be something that happens. We'll hold off on that, but that's how we enter into it. And it's a practice. You have to learn it. You have to, at first it kind of feels like, am I just imagining this? Is this just something like, oh, this popped in my head, so I'm going to say it. But over time, the more you practice it, you start to realize sort of a frequency. You realize you're able to be aware of a certain dynamic to this form of emergence, that then when you share, it's really amazing actually how often I could share a handful of experiences where something comes up and you share it and you're like, I don't know what this means, and someone's like, oh wow, that is like so meaningful to me. Like I just so one group I'll share, one person had this picture of this pink rose, and it was really fragrant. They could almost smell it, and this pink rose was just blooming and they're like, I don't know where this comes from. And then this guy who's, all the way across the country, California, DC, it's like, oh, that rose is this. And he names it. And he says, it's in my garden. It's in the very center of my garden. It's the most precious thing to me in my garden. And it just started blooming yesterday, So again, I know we're kind of wading into territory that some people might be uncomfortable with, but these experiences are really palpable and powerful. And it's connecting into that vast, subtle field of information, and as Christians, we think love, filled with love as well. So, I don't know if I strayed from answering your question, but
No, that was great. That leads me right into the next question, which is, we talked a little bit about this before, but I'm wondering where the explicit Christian angle comes into all of this, because I think one may hear this and be like, well, this sounds like a kind of like a general, you mentioned like it can sound kind of woo woo, or it's kind of like a group we space synchronicity where you're kind of sharing intuitions and resonating with people. And I wonder if some people would hear this and say, well, where's, I'm here for kind of like the Christian thing with Christ, and how does that come online in this group, and how is that emphasized?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. And I know that probably some of my language in that is I still have allergies, and I still have issues myself with things that I've grown through. And so, some of the Christian language is honestly still pretty tough for me. And actually there's even things that, that Paul does that I, at first I'm like, oh man, that's a little hard for me, just, because a lot of people carry baggage and triggers because there is so much unhealth within the Christian community. And we really need a lot of new language, a lot of new semiotics around this, these mystical experiences. And but the beauty is with that, you can you can bring back. So many people are like, wow, I grew up with this, and I thought I had to leave it all behind, but Jesus was always really special to me, and I get to have Jesus back. Like, whoa, wow, maybe I don't talk about that enough, but Jesus is pretty central to the groups, in the sense that Jesus is one of Paul's guides and is present with him a lot, and can speak to him. And so the forms of that, but again, the Christian, a lot of times we think of this as like a boundary, as like that word is so loaded, and some people say you shouldn't even use that word, but we don't see it as a boundary as much as kind of a core center that we're all kind of gravitating toward, that has its own language, that has its own dynamics. And one of the primary things of that is this core of love, that is built into the heart of Christianity, and of course other religions as well too. But one of the ways that Paul has expressed that is through the three faces of God. And the three faces of God is the integral community talks about the three faces of spirit, but the three faces of God, we can, putting that into Christian language, you have, God the Father, or God Father Mother, who's above and beyond, kind of that transcendent God. And then you have that first person God, the universal Christ, the God within, the first person experience of God that we teach as well. And then that second person experience of God. And the second person from that heart space is also a great gift of Christianity, with the person of Jesus, who a lot of people can have Jesus present with them as a guide, or can come back to Jesus in their life. If that's helpful. For some people, that's still difficult. There might be baggage, there might be triggers, and so they need a different guide. They need someone, but a second person experience. And that can be spiritual, that can be a presence, or that can be another person, right? That can be someone else that you are in a we space group with, or that right? That if we are also divine within ourselves in that first person, we can also experience the second person of God through another human. So those are some of the more explicitly Christian elements. But again, it's not meant to be restrictive or exclusive. It's kind of a common language. It's also a way of seeing things, and a gathering of how we practice and why we do. So.
Yeah, there's something I was thinking about when you were talking, which was I don't have a lot of friends who are Christian, or in the sense of like being all in on the blue kind of a level.
Mhm.
I mean, honestly, I don't have a lot of friends in general, one of the ladies that I work for, she's very devoted to her Christian path. She's a Russian Orthodox Christian,
Mm.
and I was at their house having lunch on my break, and she and her husband did the Lord's Prayer before we had lunch, and that was a really incredible experience for me because I'm standing there, and as they were praying or singing the song, it was a direct transmission, and it was literally like,
Mhm.
wow, like this is kind of the power of being like a true believer, and I felt almost a little sad afterwards because I was like, I'm so kind of like meta and intellectual, and
Yeah.
I'm like, I just never, I can't get that back on myself. And to me, the question that it brings up is, I think it can be kind of challenging to balance the more abstract, formless, general spirituality with the specific religious forms and symbols, right? And prayers and songs, and how that contains a certain power from the tradition, from the lineage, and kind of soulfulness. But then it can get very, the unhealthy parts of the blue dogmatic, and people have allergies, and like, I just got to get the hell away from that. And, and like, how do you like balance that and think about how much of that, those forms and symbols you from any Sunday church, that you bring into this?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question, and it's honestly really difficult because also what you're naming there is a tension between evolving and finding new forms and discovering new ways of gathering because we've seen the insufficiencies of what's come before. But we also want to hold with that the inclusion piece, right? How do we keep the best elements of this? And you know, if we want to talk about traditions or worship or forms like that, like you named, there's a lot of beauty and power in those things that people have been doing for centuries, and that power also has a shadow side to it, right, where people have been put under the weight of that power that is expressed in a maybe coercive or manipulative way, or traumatic way. And so yeah, a lot of people are like, I got to get away from that, like that there's a power to it, but I've experienced the bad part of that, right? And some people have experienced a better part of that. So when we get into specific forms, that's where form is so tricky because even though something's been done for thousands of years and there's a power to that, for one person that power leads to an experience of transcendence, and for another that leads to the opposite. So I think in the work of evolution, and especially for online groups where we're bringing people together from all different situations and settings and backgrounds, our emphasis so far has been more primarily to discover new forms, and so then, because it's really hard to manage or know where people are coming from with all that other stuff. So and that's more of kind of my passion anyway, is discovering new things. So but I don't want to lose some of the power in the liturgies and some of the power in some of that tradition. I don't know if even power is the right thing, but there's definitely something good in that, right? There's something healthy. I mean, even the experience of connecting to the living presence of Jesus in the subtle realm. Wilbur would say that some of these subtle forms, whenever people access them, right, it creates sort of this cosmic groove, and Jesus is maybe one of the most available presences because so many people have accessed him over the years, over the centuries, and so that creates sort of this openness, this connection, this possibility there. So again, we don't want to lose Jesus. Jesus, like I said, Jesus can have baggage. So it is a really difficult process to kind of navigate that. And just people are coming from really different places. So that's an evolutionary challenge that I would love to learn more about. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine it's kind of just a matter of trial and error too, and kind of getting the right balance, or seeing what people want, which I guess leads me to my other question, which is, what kind of people are drawn to these gatherings?
hmm Yeah, I think so. So I think one of the things that, like I said, we've identified a lot of people who are evolving or have gone through some kind of stage transition in their life. They lose their old spiritual community, and they feel pretty lonely. So that's one thing. People just trying to find an expression of spiritual community that they can connect with, that they can enter into without a lot of conflict, right? Um, so there's that. We don't get a lot of people still at those traditional levels, because they're probably more satisfied in their local church. And we try to be a little esoteric, a little, use some imagery that's a little different and maybe scare some people off. But no, I mean, it's really, we also get a lot who come from that evolutionary perspective. Teilhard de Chardin was a French Jesuit, wrote a lot about evolution, and has kind of had a popularity recently within a lot of the progressive Christian community. And so I'm seeing some of his language around how do we evolve, and what is the future of Christianity. And so there's a strong dissatisfaction amongst a lot of Christians, right? The forms of church, if you're in the US and you're seeing what's happening with evangelicalism, or these more traditional forms of Christianity that are maybe selling out, or however you want to see it, it's insufficient, right? It's insufficient. And so people are they're desiring greater complexity and greater inclusivity. They're wanting more evolved forms. And even if they can't exactly name what that is, they want it. And so when they discover something that maybe points to that, people can be really grateful, really appreciative, really hungry for that. Because it's, it's something that, we don't get. My hope, at least, is most of the people, there's a lot of people who are in that space who are still deconstructing, who are still reacting against all of the negativity, who are still, they're still in maybe a place of pain or something like that. But, and the work for those people is important and necessary. And that I see as a very targeted work, right? Those people have so many triggers, so many, you'd have to be even more careful with that. And I think that's beautiful, important work that a lot of groups out there are doing. My hope for this group is more kind of people who are, okay, I'm ready for something, right? I'm ready for something else. I'm tired of being so reactive against this, against that. I want to turn my attention upward. I want to keep growing. I want to keep learning. I want to evolve and move beyond the places that I've come from. And where can I find other people, other Christians who've share the same language as me? Where can I find people like that who want to do the same thing? And hopefully that's a question that we're trying to answer.
That's great. That's great. Giving these people kind of a place and know that, you're not alone and there isn't something wrong with you, and you can be a part of this community. Are most of the people, are they familiar with integral theory, or how many of you, what percentage would you say are familiar with integral?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, because that's another dynamic as well. Hard to give a percentage at this point. It's probably higher than it will be, because a lot of our initial pool and contacts of people were familiar with Paul's work, right? They read his books, or they'd emailed him or contacted him over the years. And he did a really great job of translating a lot of integral theory into Christianity, and also in a way that's very approachable. It's very readable. I know Wilbur can be tricky for a lot of people. It can be very intellectual or heady, or just difficult. And Paul, through his gentle spirit and kind of pastor's language of translating for people, presents really, not to take anything away, though, it's a very robust and researched and supported, presentation of it. So yeah, there are, a decent amount of people who are in these groups who are somewhat familiar with integral, who are thinking in that way and coming at it from that angle. But it's not everyone. And even though it's in our name, like, I don't want it to be, this is only a group for integralists, right? This is only a group, you have to be at this certain stage, or you have to think about things in this certain way. And then that gets into, how we think about what is integral and who is integral and those sorts of things, which is a whole nother conversation. But I think for the innovative side of this, for people who are wanting to help Christianity evolve, the integral framework can be really helpful for that, of course. So a lot of that is implicit in what we're doing and the message that we have and the forms of community that we're offering, but it's not necessary or required, especially because we're not primarily dwelling in intellectual conceptual spaces. Some of those might emerge and develop more in the future, and I hope for that. But that's another thing that we saw is within Christianity and progressive spaces, and even also sometimes within the integral community, it can be so heady, it can be so conceptual, so philosophical. So, who's integral, who's not, who's, how do we, and then what we're wanting to do is really move into the application side, to be practitioners of integral theory, to be practitioners of a more evolved Christianity. So, we're not denigrating the intellectual at all, but trying to sort of fill in some of the practical gaps of or maybe underdeveloped areas where, well, we got to actually do this, we got to actually practice this, we got to flesh it in our lives and in our spiritual gatherings, and there's definitely space for those other pursuits as well, but that's filling these gaps in community, that's filling these gaps in personal spiritual experience, along with the intellectual awareness and cognitive development that's required for stage growth and evolution.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just curious, how do you like market or like get the word out there that this exists?
Yeah, well, you tell me. No, I mean, I'm not a natural marketer, but again, I think it's just people, like I said, people are dissatisfied, people are hungry and craving for something more. So primarily it's through networking, it's through finding these groups. One of the patterns that I think is probably common in other areas, but what I've seen in the Christian landscape is, we've got this establishment, we've got this church denominations or the Catholic Church, and you kind of have this that stays very much at that traditional amber level, and so to get into more progressive spaces, that tends to emerge around a thought leader, right? So someone writes about things in a different way. You have a Richard Rohr, you have on a smaller level, a Paul Smith, or someone like Brian McLaren, or someone writes about it more from a political lens, like Jim Wallace, and people kind of gather up around this thought leader. I said all men. I really should include women, but it's Christianity. So no, there are some good women thought leaders as well, but no, it's like, so they gather around this thought leader, and so these are kind of these new emergent structures, and they have to create some sort of stability and organization. So like, around Richard Rohr, there's the Center for Action and Contemplation, and they have their goals and what they're about. So the thought leader model is one way to find people, right? You tap into these networks and you see kind of what this group is doing and what they're lacking, and this group and this group and this group. But I do think the thought leader model is somewhat insufficient because it's still hierarchical. It's still based around this one person's thought. But that's how innovation happens a lot of times, right? So it's kind of this tension and balance between we want to create a community that is more integral, more inclusive, more supported, that there's still growth hierarchy, but it's something where we're not just gathering around this one person, right? Or maybe even we're not just gathering around this one idea. I don't know. I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head there, but yeah, how do you find those people? So far, it's been kind of tapping into those networks of where those thought leaders have progressed or carried things forward. But the internet's evolving constantly, and so it creates a lot of different opportunities. I haven't done a lot of active marketing at this point. A little bit on Facebook, finding some of those groups, but then you're only limited to the Facebook crowd, which there's people there, but there'll be grassroots, there'll be word of mouth. That's just what kind of comes to mind off the top of my head, but I'm not an expert in marketing, and that's a big question. How do we connect people, right? How do we find the people who are actually interested in this, that, or the other? And I think some of the forms of technology that can facilitate that are still yet to be developed. I would love to see that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm no marketing expert, but I guess the reason why I care about this topic so much is because just as how you mentioned, right? There are so many people who are hungry for this. They just don't know that this exists.
Mhm.
And I was thinking maybe one group it might be interesting to connect with would be like the Unitarian Universalists. Have you ever thought about that as a market to tap?
I know, right? And how do you even talk about it? It's like, well, I mean, it's a market, tapping the market, but it's also, yeah, I mean, sharing the news, right? Spreading. The Unity Church, so Unitarian's a little different. The Unity Church, which is across the U.S. and is actually has a headquarters just outside of Kansas City, has officially adopted integral theory into their practice, and so into their denomination. So they're very open to it. We have a few Unity pastors around the country who follow Paul and are really connected into this. So some of the people that have come into our network are through those avenues. Now, it's definitely not every Unity church, but that's definitely a more progressive space, maybe a little more involved. So that's one area. I mean, the Unitarian. Again, there's some other people out there in the Christian landscape who are trying to do centers and work, and there's always kind of this tension between tapping into existing structures and if you're going to try and work within a denomination, the tentacles get on you in one way or another, and I don't know, it's tricky. It's tricky. But the Unitarian, that's a good thought. Again, the percentage of people, well, no, I'll stop there.
Yeah. I mean, another question I wanted to ask you, just getting a more meta perspective, maybe in some ways a more kind of lower right quadrant question is, what is your general take on the state of Christianity and religion in the U.S. right now? And this is something I'm kind of shamefully uninformed on, Christianity and Western religion in general. And you had alluded to earlier, kind of like what we're seeing now, and there's different like evangelical groups. And so, given that you were raised in this and you're kind of closer to the ground than I am on these topics, what is your kind of general picture of the state of affairs with all of this? And I wonder what role what you're developing here can kind of play in moving some of this forward.
Sure. That's a great question. And I first want to say I'm definitely not an expert in this. But I mean, I can share from my own experience and the way I see it through the integral lens. I think what you have is a pretty strong traditional amber base of Christianity, right? That's sort of the sweet spot. And you have this kind of mythic literal religion as it's practiced by so many people in the United States. And then you also have kind of this, and I think it's too much to just put them in one space. I think there's a lot of that goes into the modern, and there's a lot of that then also regresses or taps also into kind of the magic or the red power dynamics, warrior stage, as Paul calls it. But then you also have some more progressive churches, and you have this sort of Christian expression of postmodernism that's also still tied into modernism in some ways, depending on what expression it is. But it's just another illustration of the culture wars, right? Where you have this sort of progressive church that has failed to include the traditional levels, that has failed to value them and to see their worth and what's good about them and what they can offer. And so in that, and that, that they're acting out of their own allergies, they're acting out of their own space and their own hurts and wounds. And so I have a lot of compassion for people, in that space as well, because it's really hard to appreciate a structure or a system that has wounded you and that has oppressed people, and that has, if we look at a systems level, it's like, get rid of that, but the people within that and the things that they're subjected to, having been within that structure, there's a lot of good people in there, and people say that, and maybe it's hard to see, but a lot of times we're at the mercy of the structures that are built above and around us. And a lot of people don't have the tools to get out of that or to know what to do with that. So I have a lot of compassion for those people. I also believe in stage rights, that people do have a right to be where they are. And when the time comes for them to evolve, like if they're ready, if they can, then we want to help facilitate that. But we can't make that happen. We have to support the healthiest development at that level that we can. So again, the cultural wars, the failure of sort of the progressive postmodern church, but also just society and culture, which then the traditional level has sort of villainized and set up as an enemy. And I think in the continual failure to beat that enemy has then regressed into more of a warrior stage, into more of a, well, Trump may have a lot of issues, but he's a bulldog and he's going to get things done for us, right? And maybe some of that's built out of ignorance, or they didn't know all of what that would be, or some people are still in that, So it's kind of a, our tribe needs to win, so we're going to turn to this force that's going to win for us, So that's a little bit of my take on it, and so there's a lot of co-option there. There's a lot of fake religion, unhealthy, civil, white supremacist, that calls itself Christian, that gets kind of lumped into that as well. So I don't know, I don't want to include that or put that in the same landscape as sort of maybe good-hearted evangelicals who are trying to do the right thing. They are out there. There are people like that. So like all that to say, I think it's an expression of the culture wars and the failure of, the leading edge to really to integrate and to help each stage be healthy and be allowed to be what it is in a comfortable, nurturing way.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. One thing I was talking to another person about who's very interested in integral Christianity is what role a kind of integral church can play in helping to heal some of these divides in the culture wars and include everyone. And I guess I don't know if you have any thoughts on this specific question, but to me, I don't see a real way you can kind of get around the mythic literal problem, because if you're going to have these people of different stages coexist all in the same community, it's like, well, did Jesus literally walk on water or did he not? Is that right? And I don't really know how that would be navigated. I can understand the role of allowing people to translate healthily where they're at, but do you have any thoughts on that problem of the literal versus the symbolic and how we can kind of integrate that or coordinate that?
Yeah. Again, I think with that, and this is just my take, which is limited, but I think what I would say to that is that it's an issue of framing, and it's an issue of attention. What are we focusing on, right? If I'm really going to push against a traditionalist and want to rile them up, and push their buttons and maybe hopefully spark them into a split space of deconstruction and, losing their religion and whatever, like, I can really challenge the virgin birth, or I can really challenge that kind of mythic literal stuff. I don't know how helpful that is, honestly, though, because I think when it really comes down to it, those things aren't the most important thing, right? If someone's going to evolve, those probably need to be, let go of at some point. But it's not crucial. It's not like people think that Jesus walked on water and so they don't want immigrants coming into this country, right? I think it's more, again, trying to reach into and facilitate and help create healthier spaces in those traditional churches, right? Our church is not about, what we're about is love, right? And if you go to some of those core messages in the Bible, it gets co-opted, it gets bastardized, it gets manipulated into, being about homosexuality or being about this, that, or the other. And I think that's the unhealthy version of religion. That's the coercive, the manipulative. But you can still have traditional stage amber religion that doesn't go into that space. You can focus on the message of love. You can focus on loving your enemy. You can do those things. That's, of course, easier said than done. I think the structures and the ways that it's been created, especially within evangelical Christianity and the hierarchy and the, everything there, you'd have to change a lot of that as well to actually facilitate those things within more than the tribal identity. I think the tribalism is the trickier part there than sort of believing in the literal myths. It's the tribalism that then creates exclusivity and the conflation of that tribalism with patriotism and with certain expressions of that. So easier said than done. Like I said, I don't know how you you change churches to be like that. And I don't think you do. Maybe from my perspective, it's like the institutional old forms of church are just going to die out. It's going to look like Europe in the future. We're not going to have transformed blue churches. We're going to have new forms that evolve, that create spaces where people can gather and feel comfortable and feel supported and empowered. And within that, hopefully some spaces that also create settings for people in that traditional level space. That's not my passion. That's not what I really want to work on. But I hope there are some people out there who want to do that and seek to create new spaces. I think the old structures and systems are too corrupt and misorganized, and the structures are off to try and transform within. And I think a lot of the leaders feel that way as well. But that's also really tough to these forms that have been around for so long, to get people to be like, well, you don't need to go to church anymore. Like, come to this, this bar on Saturday nights, or whatever people are doing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great answer. That's really, that kind of reframing the focus. I think that's really kind of a helpful way of thinking about it. That kind of segues into another question I wanted to ask you is, what is your kind of long-term vision or inspiration with where you want to take all of this? Do you have kind of like a ideal picture of where you want to go with this type of practice and community?
Yeah. Well, idealism is tricky because I'm definitely an idealist, but I mean, if I really want to go to the full extreme, it's like, evolved Christianity. It's this, new ways of people coming together and experiencing the divine. And, like I said, churches are dying, and I think that system is going into decline and will eventually go into compost. And so, the work of innovation, the work of emergence is to experiment with people, to create communities of practice and find new ways of doing things. And so as we play with that process, both as our organization, the way that we do it, but also in empowering and facilitating other innovators to experiment and create with other forms in their own local communities. And then we learn from one another. We see what works here, what doesn't work there. We learn from one another. We have support, we have collaboration, and, new structures emerge. And it's not like one thing is necessarily going to work for everywhere, but we find elements and values that work, that resonate with people. And then, so these things have been through the ringer, they've been tested, they've been practiced, so that when that system and structure of institutional religion really crashes, which I think, it's probably going to happen, then there's a transition, right? We can say, hey, here's this, and that's kind of the way with all systems of innovation, right? You have something that's created, that's new, but most people aren't early adopters, right? Most people are, they're good with what's comfortable, with what's normal. Right now, church is normal, even though it's really jacked up, and there's all, and people are having issues, and more people are leaving. But my hope also too is that people can see that as they leave, they're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? There is still a huge value and importance to spiritual practice, to having some core of identity within them that connects to the divine, that has meaningful experiences of spiritual community. And so that's my ultimate vision, is that we have these innovators connecting and creating these new forms and spaces that can then facilitate a healthy religion, right? Can facilitate that healthy conveyor belt of leading people through each of those stages of development into higher consciousness, and fuller ways of being in the Christian landscape.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard a lot of people talk about how their prediction is these churches are eventually going to go in a full decline, and people are already talking about how the pews are empty and attendance has been plummeting. And coming from the Buddhist background, that's also been an issue in Hawaii too, with the Buddhist temples. And I remember talking to some teenagers whose family are Christian and they go to Christian church, and I was talking to the kids in private, and they're like, yeah, we hate all the religious stuff, but we really like the community.
Yeah.
And it's interesting hearing that, because I'm like, I wonder how many people feel similarly, and the role that the specifically these kind of Christian communities can play with supporting people. Like if you endured some kind of tragedy, your child died or something in a car accident, and the way that there are people will just support you and kind of rally behind you, that's not something that you get from like a mindfulness meditation group or a yoga studio or something, right? Yeah. And that's some baby I really want to preserve of
Mm.
those kind of with those kind of blue communities that have a tremendous amount of social cohesion. And I'm just kind of wondering if you have any thoughts on how to preserve that real intimate aspect of community support in what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, community is such a huge need that people feel, whether they've come out of a religious experience or whether they haven't either. That there's this balance between kind of the post-Christian, and then, as you said, as this gets less and less familiar, there's not going to be people aren't going to grow up with that and be like, oh, I can have Jesus again. It's like, who's Jesus? It would be initial first discovery. So that's going to change with generations and shifts and whatnot. But the community side of it, the some of these beautiful aspects of blue community, I don't know. I mean, I recognize that, there's a lot of people who go through deconstruction or go through this, this process of evolving through Christianity, and they kind of miss that. They kind of miss the, like, oh, it was all so simple and we were together and there was just this ease and harmony. It's not too different from, like, oh, the 50s were so great and that was the best time. And it's like, well, yeah, if you were in the in crowd or whatever, like, you remember the better things, not like our church was so great and everyone else was going to hell, right? But but the good things with that, right? I don't know if we can preserve the exact form of that, right? But we definitely still need to value healthy community and how we can create spaces like that for people. I think the sort of one-stop shop, local church, your community's here, that place where you can go when something happens. I don't know. I don't know if how that will look in the future. I think the commodification of spirituality and of really anything, right, is going to be really hard to, I think a lot of people, when they look at, we just need to create a new center, right, where people can come and there's, it's just more evolved and everything is here. But with specialization, it's like, I'm going to go to this podcast to get my information because they're way better than this local pastor, right? I'm going to go to this music on Spotify because that's what helps me experience transcendence better than, like, this dude playing a guitar in this room or whatever. Or I'm going to go to here for community, there's going to be this online community space that taps into this one form of meditation or co-meditation in a way that really enlivens me, where other people don't. In my local center, they're doing this form of circling that's really focused around, like, interpersonal healing, and that's great or whatever, but that's not for me right now. So this sort of individualization, this commodification is, some people look at it and say it's really problematic, and probably in some ways it is, but to try and sort of hold back the waves of that and do things in old forms isn't going to work, right? We have to find ways that tap into that, but also then lead into fuller expressions of community. At least that's the way I see it. So, yeah, those community spaces, I don't know. I don't think they're going to look like they did, but they're going to have to look different. And again, I feel like the only way we can discover that is to explore it, to practice together, to seek emergence with people who are asking those questions. And that's hopefully what our network is doing to some extent.
Right, right. I mean, I know it's almost impossible to do this with an online group, but the other thing I always kind of appreciated about the Christian communities, in contrast to the Zen community that I was from, was their emphasis on, like, outward community service
Mm-hmm.
and feeding the homeless or whatever they're doing. Right, they always kind of made their presence visible to the public by doing something good for the larger community that they were in. And whatever motive behind it, I don't know, but I still kind of missed that. I was always trying to push that angle, at my Zen temple, where more of the focus was on meditation, and we didn't do a lot of community service as much out in the wider community. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how that could be preserved or emphasized, other than, because I think one criticism of some of the integral communities is that they're kind of too upper left quadrant, or a little bit too much kind of like an insulated container bubble, and how to bring that out, and do something for the masses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
If you have any thoughts.
that's a great question, and it is really important, and it is, like you said, difficult to do with online communities. You can talk about that stuff, you can engage with it, and then encourage people to go do that kind of on their own in their own local communities, and that's good, but that has barriers as well. that is certainly something that is very baked into the Christian message, right? You can't read Jesus and leave that out, or think that, oh, it's not important to feed the poor or care for the needy. Um, and yeah, as an integral, coming from my experience of green, I have some green allergies, right? I have some difficulties there. You can get kind of the social justice warrior energy, and so we got to move beyond our own reactivity for that as well, and find more healthy expressions of that. Like you said, where's that coming from? What's the source of that? And my own spiritual ego was so puffed up that it had to be kind of slayed, cut down from within. So, but again, yeah, that's important. That we have to transcend and include, and figure out how to do that. Yeah, as things move more and more online, I don't know. That's a great question, but like I said, the good thing is that's really tied into the Christian message. That's really tied into the words of Jesus, and so if this is a Christian group, then, you can't just be like, well, we're just going to sit here and meditate. Like, no, we have to, and our groups feel that. They're like, oh, how do we take this to the world? How do we, how do we engage that? And we're trying to do that on an energetic level, right? This kind of space that we have of love and this energy field of practice, we're trying to kind of send that out into the world. Maybe sort of a Christian form of Tonglen or whatever, but also taking that and being more practical with that, right? How do we concretely live that in our lives? And as long as we're gathering online, that's always going to be a difficulty, because we can't really do that as much together. But maybe new ways will emerge with that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome, man. Well, before we start wrapping up, was there anything else that you wanted to share or tell us about what you're doing?
Yeah, I think I want to come back to just maybe like it's emphasizing that heart space, and kind of spiritual practice within the integral community, because I think yeah, as integralists we can get really focused on the cognitive line of development, and we can see we can get focused on having discussion and talking about things and how to fix things, and get really in our heads, right? And I think some of the the emphasis on spiritual practice that some people have in the community is really important. But I also think one of the great, contributions of Paul and of our group to this is a real engagement with the heart, right? A real entrance into heart energy. To Teilhard de Chardin says that the source of evolution is love, right? That this drive to greater inclusivity and greater complexity comes on a quantum level of materiality that is baked into the existence of matter, that compels it to love, to include more, to connect, and to grow in complexity. So I think so many of our efforts for evolution, it's always good to peel back the layers and to look at identity and to look at why we're doing things, and look at shadow, and why am I doing this? Why do I care about evolution? Why do I want people to do this, that, and the other, right? We always have to be examining our own motivations and what's driving us. And I think what I see personally, and I think can be a really powerful agent for lots of people, is to connect to that. Teilhard calls it the deep surge of love within us that drives us into that work. And we can do that through more engagement in our heart space, whether you're a Christian or not, wherever you're coming from, and really connecting your thought, your work, your energy, your efforts, whatever you're doing, to that deep space of love, because that I think is the core of the work of evolution and of developing consciousness, so that we can have a more loving world. And I don't say that in any kind of new age frou-frou way, right? That can involve ego death, that can involve all sorts of things that will lead us to places that I don't think that we will just go to cognitively, or that we will maybe necessarily choose when metal hits the wall. I can't think of the idiom or whatever. But when push comes to shove, it's like, and this actually becomes difficult, or there's something that arises in your life, and it's like, well, that was a fun idea, and I was working on it, but I think that core place of love as a source of motivation, as the energy from which we're acting out of, is really crucial, and I think a really wonderful gift that we can tap into.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up again. And I think it's so important because of how, as you described, how kind of intellectual the integral community has become. And I think what you just shared right there, we need to really take the essence of that and develop that more. And I think some people have an allergy when they hear talking about love in the heart, because they're like, get that green bullshit out of here, son, And but I think what I like about this is when it's framed in this kind of integral Christianity way, that people are like, oh, that's kind of something sexy I can get on board with. It's kind of like it's taking something traditionally associated with a very blue kind of amber association, and then you're bringing it into this higher light in this integral context, and that's kind of like people are really yearning for that. And I think when you frame that transformative power of divine love in that context, people are more the green allergy is going to be kind of mitigated.
Sure, yeah. Hopefully that's coming from a deep divine. Not that kind of new agey, like, oh, just love everyone, right? But there's
Right.
there's a depth in that. There's a tradition that's coming out of that involves the cross, that involves like the death of self for the sake of the world, and not in like a saving from hell kind of way, but in like a this is the path of transformation kind of way.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Luke, thank you so much. That's a great way to close it. Just before we end here, can you just tell us a little bit about how people can get in touch with the group, and how they eventually like join in?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is integralchristiannetwork.org. And we have a weekly writing that comes out on Sundays that you can subscribe to on the mailing list. If you're interested in participating in a WeSpace group, there's a sign-up page there that you can join a WeSpace group, and kind of try and practice some of this stuff like I described at the beginning. There's also written descriptions there if you have more questions, or there's a contact page on there as well. So that's the best way to connect with what we're doing.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Luke, thank you so much for taking the time to come on today, and it was really a pleasure to talk to you. And good luck with with everything.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a definite pleasure to talk. Appreciated. Great conversation. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right, sounds good.
All right. Bye.